Well, hello there. So I'm going to show you how to do my rhombus stitch. And this is a stitch video, not a project video. So it's not a complete project. It's showing you how to do the stitch, and the projects will come later. Okay? So I am going to show you the stitch, and there it is, called rhombus because rhombus is a diamond shape. So that's what it looks like. Really pretty stitch. And this is when it's lacy, and you can have it even lacier. I'm using just a worsted weight on a 3/4 inch gauge. So it's not a bulky, it's a worsted weight. And this is what it looks like. If you were to use a bulky or something, you would the stitches would all be closer together and your diamonds would be smaller. So that's what would happen. And if you had even thinner yarn, or well, you're not going to get much wider than this unless you go into a 1-inch specialty gauge, but then you just have bigger diamonds. So this is what it looks like. The stitch itself doesn't have a tendency to curl very much, maybe only slightly. So I just used an owl eye edge. So how I started out, I just did a chain cast on, and there'll be a link in the description on this video. You have to scroll down to see it, but the video is on my channel of how to do this chain crochet cast on. And then I just did 2 rows of owl eye stitch, and that's also on my channel. And of course you'll see me doing some owl eye stitch because I did that on this edge. You can use any kind of an edge that you actually like. I knew I wasn't going to have to use any purls since it didn't have hardly any curl at all. So I decided to do owl eye. And I marked quite a few pegs as owl eye, 3 pegs. You could get away with 2, I think. But what this did is make the pattern come down to there and then just the owl eye that far. And this is kind of like the transition row here with just kind of partial type, stitch right there where you're going into this pattern. So if you use less pegs, it would be, you wouldn't have as big a border on the side, basically. You could also use a garter stitch border and a garter at the bottom. But it's coming along very nicely. The inside looks like this. You have some strings with this stitch, but they're not very long. They go in with the pattern, and they don't show at all. So there you go. So let's get started doing the stitch. Oh, the yarn. I didn't tell you about the yarn. I told you about everything else. I just said it was worsted. Okay. So the yarn I'm using. Now this yarn has no stretch at all. So if I can do this stitch without it getting too tight with no stretch at all, you should be able to do it with most yarns. But the reason it has no stretch is it is a silk. It's silk, mohair, and then 10% wool. So it's 45% silk, 45% mohair, and 10% wool. And it really has no stretch at all. And it is a roving material, but oh, it is a nice material. I really like it. It's Noro Silk Garden. And the color here is color 500, and it has all these colors in the color run. Okay, there, now you have everything. You can probably ask me about the loom hook too. They don't make this particular loom hook anymore. It was a Canadian company and they stopped making them. Loom hooks like this, you're not going to be able to find, but there are similar ones on Etsy. And probably other places too. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so the way you're going to have to mark your loom, and I did it, you should mark at least the 2 pegs. The yellow markers are the pegs you should have marked, one on each side, and then these are my end stitches in the orange, and this is my transition peg right there, has the yellow marker on it. And you're going to want uneven pegs, and that's important. They have to be uneven. Okay, so I have, I think it's 23. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Yeah, I have 23. So I'm making kind of a wide scarf or a more narrow shawl, but it's for a summer shawl. And even though this has the mohair and the wool, it's not a really warm fabric with all the silk in it. It does a wonderful lace, and it's good. It's good for the hot weather. But you can use, you could even use acrylic yarn. You can use any kind of yarn that you want to do this stitch. It will work. Okay? You don't have to use you don't have to make it into a summer. And you can also use the stitch I'm showing you in other stitches. It works really well with owl eye because owl eye is a little bit longer stitch, so it goes with it. So you can do it across in a pattern like that, but it will work in all kinds of projects that you have. Okay, so this is the transition peg. The stitch is just one stitch. It's the same stitch all the way through, but we alternate it. And it's always done on 2 pegs. So to explain this to you, because we're alternating it, the first 2 pegs will be this yellow one and the one next to it. Now you can use more markers to differentiate your pegs if that helps you, but these 2 will always be wrapped when we're going to the right, the one with the yellow marker and the one next to it. Then these 2 will go together, then the next 2 will go together, the next 2 will go together all the way to the end until we get here with these 2 going together. Because we're odd, this yellow peg sits there, so we're going to give it a different treatment. Then when we go back, our first peg will be this yellow marker one, and these 2 pegs will be wrapped together, and then these 2, and then these 2, and that's how we alternate the stitch. Okay, so however you want to mark that. Okay, so I'm all ready to do this stitch, and because I was doing owl eye here, I don't remember if I gave it 1 or 2 stitches, and I did give it both stitches, so I had to take it off to be sure, and I'm just going to knit it over. And just a second, I have a frog in my throat, so I will put you on pause and be back in a second. Okay, I'm back. All right, so we're going to start the stitch. Now there's 2 things to remember. This is a really easy stitch, and I think even beginners can do it. However, there's just a couple things you really have to keep in mind. And the first thing is you need to do it loose. If you don't do it loose, it's going to really tighten up on you. It has a tendency to tighten up if you start to tighten up. So just keep it loose, and you can always loosen it as you go. So it's very easy that way. And the other thing is you can really mess up the pegs that you wrap together. So I'm going to make sure I explain to you how to keep that straight, okay? So here's the first 2 pegs. So all you do, now this stitch I developed, it's an older stitch that I have, and I developed it out of twisty stitch. After I did twisty, I did this stitch. So what it is it's basically twisty stitch. If you've done my twisty, it's twisty stitch over 2 pegs. That's all it is. A very easy stitch. So these 2 pegs, you go over the 2 very loose. If you're not loose, pull out your yarn to make sure it's loose, and then just knit them over. Okay, then you're going to come back loosely in front of the 2 pegs again and knit them over. And you're always going to knit the first peg that you wrap. So when you went this way, this was the first one that got this yarn. So you knit it over first. Okay. Then we're going to come from the back and go to the next 2 pegs. Now, it's a bit of a reach to come from the back and go to the next 2 pegs. But the way to always remember what pegs you wrap is wherever this working yarn was at, it was peg 1. So this was peg 1, this was peg 2. So you have to go over here to the next peg 1 and 2, the next 2 peg pair. So you go back behind number 2 and then over 2 and 3. So if you can always remember that, wherever the yarn is, you're at peg 1, you know where you have to go to the next peg 1. And then we go over it. And then back, nice and loose. And see, you can actually make this one looser as you knit it over. You see that I hold this very loosely in my hand. Okay, and then come back and go over the next 2 nice and loose. And knit them. And then over the next 2 nice and loose. And knit them. Come back behind and over the next 2 and knit them. And then back in front and knit them. It's pretty easy and you go really quite fast. Okay, I'll go into more detail. I got quite a ways to go down there. Now, if you find you do start to get too tight, just loosen up from that point. And it also depends the kind of pegs you're on. You can knit a little tighter if you're on really loose pegs that are easy to knit off. This one's important not to be tight because you'd have a hard time knitting this over if it was tight. Okay, now we're at the yellow peg. It can't be wrapped when we're going this way, so we're just going to owl eye it. So we go over it like this, nice and loose, knit it off, come back behind, and knit it and the next one, knit it off. Whatever peg you're on when you do owl eyes, peg 1, you go from behind, in front, and over, peg 1 and 2, knit them off. On peg 1, over peg 1 and 2, knit them off. And if you don't want to do the same edge I did, you certainly don't have to, but I will show you how to do this one since I have to do it anyway. Okay, and so then I come back just like this. In the project video, I'll go into more detail. Okay, I've got a bit of a knot here in my yarn I got to deal with. Okay, so now here we are, and I think I only did 1 stitch on here, but I got to take it off to check now because I started talking. Yeah, I only did 1 stitch, and I need to do 2 stitches on here. So knit this over, come around again and knit it over again, and there we go. Now this time this is peg 1 and this is peg 2. Now when we look at this, I'm going to get close so you can see it. There, I think you can see it here. You can see there's a dip here, and yet these are here. You can see these 2 pegs were wrapped together. You can see these 2 weren't. So that'll also help you when you're going across. After you've done the first row, you can see you're always going to wrap the 2 pegs that weren't wrapped together. These weren't wrapped together. These weren't wrapped together. You can see it when you look. It should keep you from getting mixed up. So anyway, we go over peg 1 and 2 here, knit them off this way. We come back and nice and loose and knit it off. Go from behind, go over the next 2, knit them off, come back, knit them off, go to the next 2. So that's all there is to the stitch. Very easy stitch. I think really a beginner can do it. All you have to do is remember how to tell where you're at, and you become really good at it after you've done a few rows. And if you leave the working yarn, have to go do somewhere, you're always at this peg and you know you have to go over, right? So if you came back down after being away, you'd go, okay, I'm on peg 1, so I've wrapped these 2 together, so I got to go behind and go over to this next 2 peg pair. Very easy. There. Get myself some more yarn. Okay, so we're coming up to the other end, and I'll just show you how I'm doing that. Now you're going to have to do some kind of transition because you're alternating. You're always going to have that extra peg, and you have to have a way of treating that extra peg. And because you're putting 2 stitches on these 2 pegs by going back like this, it's usually better to put 2 stitches on the transition peg to the next stitch, because otherwise it will have less yarn on it and bigger holes and be tighter there. Okay, so we're going behind. These are the 2 we did, so we're going to go behind them to the next peg. We're just going to knit it over, then knit it over again, and just do owl eye to the end. So if you do another end, you're still going to need to treat that peg somehow. If you don't want to do owl eye on it, you're going to have to do a couple stitches on it of some kind. Okay, and then I'm just going to stay here at the last owl eye peg because we're just going to go over what I've already shown you. So that's all there is to it. And I haven't stretched out the work yet, but I'll stretch it out a little bit and then we can look at it when it's stretched out and see the diamonds are even more coming more out. So it's very, very pretty stitch. Rhombus stitch. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, bye.